Series 4, Space Law, Policies and Debris Regulation. Are we safe? Our main aim of today is to raise awareness, to create awareness and to identify the criteria for developing relevant instruments to fill the possible gaps in the legal body in outer space, specifically on space debris mitigation. On the subject, the fundamental role of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space in supporting states in implementing the existing regulations has a key role in promoting international mechanism of cooperation to exchange information on registration and notification procedures and institutional requirements to improve space traffic management for the sustainability of space activities. So the structure of the show will have two parts. The first one dedicated to presentations and information on the current and future challenges on space debris mitigation. And the second part of the show will be followed with an interactive discussion with questions and answers from mentees and mentors and guests directly. I have the privilege to introduce you to Professor Dr. Kai-Uwe Schrogl and Dr. Tanja Masson. Help me with your second name, please, Tanja. Zwaan. Yes. So our moderator and of course our mentor, Cristina Galhego. Our moderator for today's series is going to be Ms. Ursula Castillo-Guevara. She's a professional expert in the UN Sustainability Development Agenda 2030 and space policy development. Ursula, the mic is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hien. Thank you to all participants present here today. It's really an honor to be present together with all of you virtually as space law experts that are actively supporting the creation of suitable policies and laws to fulfill the remaining gaps of the space legal regime. And as mentioned previously, with international law that is applicable to operation in space, it's mainly the product of the United Nations Committee for the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, legal subcommittee, who has the main role of studying and reviewing the issues and also the legal aspects that are arising from space activities. And nowadays, one of the main challenges is to be able to manage the increasing number of space debris and space objects that have been cast during in-orbit collisions in lower orbit and that are increasing exponentially and are creating a very risky environment for our operating satellites and also for the current and future space missions. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what's the current situation, what could be the possible solution, and also what are the challenges ahead in specific, what are the policies and laws that are now being created to address the issue. So we'll proceed with the presentation of our first panelist, Cristina Galhego. Welcome. She's Space4Women UNOOSAS Mentor. She's an entrepreneur and CEO founder of DIPTERON UEG and also a space law expert. She will presenting an overview of space debris regulations with some slides. She will also talk a little bit about what are the current mechanisms and regulations on space debris mitigation and space traffic management. So Ana Cristina, I give you the floor, and thank you to be present here today.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here to participate in this panel with so important people. And well, I hope this time can be useful for everybody to share some views in also a little informal way, I hope. So I'd like to, can you see my slides? Yes.
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 You should put it on presentation mode, Cristina.
It's not on the.
No, we see it,
right.
but it's not in presentation mode.
It's
Slideshow.
on the downside to the right. There are 4 icons. The fourth one to the right. The other one, that one. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Finally. Okay, I will give my presentation. Is a very not so deep overview, just for us to pick up some points and then remember or put also on the table to discuss. So first I would like to give you just a brief overview about our situation, about the scenario of space debris. It's true that space technology has brought many benefits for our society. But however, these benefits have not been achieved without negative consequences. And one of them is the space debris. The number of space debris has increased since 1957, when the space activities started. And one example, we can see the number of debris, the scenario in 2014, thousands of pieces of debris in this picture. And part of this increase was due the 2 examples, the collision between 2 satellites, the American satellite Iridium 33 and the non-functional Russian satellite 2241, the number of satellites in 2009. And they also do the Chinese and satellite missile test that's happened in 2007. So, but to increase this, we have the Kessler syndrome. Where peace can hit each other and increase much more the number of space debris on orbit. I would like to show some examples that some of the debris falling to Earth. This space debris followed in some parts of the world, but I would highlight recently we had a Chinese rocket fallen in the ocean this month, the beginning of this month, that landed in the Atlantic Ocean, weighing nearly 18 tons. This was very cross near New York, was a very alarming situation in the world. But what these main risks that space debris can bring? Space debris, it can bring collisions in operations, satellites, in spacecrafts, and also collisions in the international station. And also can bring damage to human property and the environment. That's also one example that we can give is the Cosmo 954 that fallen down in Canada and damaged the lake with a lot of amount of radioactivity. So, what is the solutions and actions? We could have a short solutions in short term to minimize the operations, and also to the systematic to prevent accidents and to protect zones. And also we could have solutions for in long term that could the orbit could be the systematic deorbiting or escape. In other words, that we could act as to activity debris remove. All these actions are some of these are adopted in some documents that I listed here, and one of them I will further to give some views. For space debris regulations, how is the space debris regulation? Under international space law, we have the Outer Space Treaties, Outer Space Treaty, the Rescue Agreement, the Liability Convention, Registration Convention, and the MON agreements, and the principles and also resolutions. But under international space law, there is no definition of space debris. And, excuse me. And also for us to discuss about liability or in case of request compensation for damage, under Article 7 of the Space Treaty, the liability addressed for space objects, not for space debris. Space object means functional object, and space debris is a non-functional object. So under international space law, there is no explicit international legal obligation to mitigate risks associated with space debris, and it does not establish a sufficient and appropriate. Excuse me. I had a problem here with my presentation. Just a minute. Oh, come on my screen. And also under international space law, it does not establish a sufficient and appropriate legal regime to internationally regulate the serious risks created by space debris. So under national space legislation, we have adopted the United Nations space debris mitigations and some national space legislation also define space, give the definition of space debris. We can mention some national space legislations as France, Belgium, Japan, the Netherlands, Russia, Germany, US. And under regional organizations, under European, we have example as the European Space Agency that also regulated this space debris mitigation. ESA has a space debris handbook and also an administrative instructions on space debris mitigation for agency projects. This is based in the international, the EADC guidelines for space debris mitigations and the space debris mitigations of the scientific and technical subcommittee of the UN Corpus. So we can see that under international space law, there is a lack of regulation, but under national space legislation and regional organizations, we have already adoptions of the space debris mitigation regulation. Example for space debris policy, we have in USA national policy that in example that give in 1988 minimize the creation of space debris in tests. In 1999 encourage other countries to adopt the space debris minimization policies. In 1996 develop design guidelines for space debris minimization and take a leadership role in promoting international adoption. And in 2006, following national orbital debris mitigation standards and incorporate into license of commercial satellites. So under US policy, adopt some space debris mitigation guidelines. So how is developing legally binding rules on space debris matters in international law? How we can build these rules? So there is a committee, United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, that was established in 1958, composed by member states, and they have decisions by consensus. Also, all member states need to accept or have a consensus in any matter. The United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Space has two subcommittees: the scientific and the scientific and technical subcommittee and the legal subcommittee. Under these two subcommittees, the space debris, there is a working group for the technical, there is a working group on long-term sustainability of outer space, that under this group are discussions about the space debris matters. And under the legal subcommittee, we have under agenda general exchange of information and views on legal mechanisms relating to space debris mitigation measures, taking account the work of the scientific and technical subcommittee. So this committee is responsible to bring rules and build for the space debris, all matters in international level for space law or space debris. What are the current efforts for reach long-term sustainability of outer space? So we have the United Nations COPUS, Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. I already mentioned the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, the working group that was adopted in 2008 by consensus and address space debris mitigations and remediation measures. And under this working group, there is an expert group B that lead with the space debris, space operations, and tools to support space situational situational awareness. So also, we have the United Nations Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines that are technical standards to limit the creation of orbital debris. They are voluntary measures. They are based under the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee's Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines, and was adopted by the United Nations Committee, Prof, in 2007, under the resolution 62/217. These guidelines are applicable to missions, planning and design of spacecraft and orbital stages that will be sent into Earth's orbit. There are 22 guidelines, and these guidelines were approved this year after almost 10 years of working. So we have now approved these 21 guidelines. So they are technical measures, and they are now approved after almost 10 years of work in this committee. For the future efforts for reaching long-term sustainability, we could address the space situational awareness that where the working group on long-term sustainability of outer space also take this item. And we also could address the space traffic management that could give you the ability to design maneuver to avoid collisions. And this item is also being addressed in the working group on long-term sustainability of outer space. And we have also a challenge that for now, for the future, that is the active debris removal. That means that we can, the situation that remove space debris in orbit. But this task is not easy, is very complex, is expensive, and we need to reach a lot of efforts to arrive to get this effort. So in this, for these efforts, we have also a lot of challenges, legal challenges that I can also address under space law. There is no legal distinction when we going to have a space debris removal. There is no distinction between a functional satellite and non-functional space debris. Space object is under jurisdiction and control of the launching state. There is the liability from active debris removal operations. And also there is the problem of intellectual property rights. And also there is one more challenge that I forgot to miss. That is regarding the security. That also is one of the most important point between the member states. So thank you. I would like to, for this, I finished my presentation with some points that I addressed.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ana Cristina. Thank you for your presentation, also for giving an overview of what are the current instruments that are addressing the issues of space debris mitigation. And also, as mentioned previously, we have seen that there are currently a very low amount of countries that count with national space legislations. And this is something really important and needs also to be addressed, and also to encourage more states to recognize the current international space legal framework, and also especially the UN treaties governing outer space activities. I have also followed some of the questions that have arrived from the chat, and I would like to give the word to Tanja, and maybe talk a little bit about how we also could encourage more states to recognize the UN treaties governing outer space activities, and also how we can motivate them to develop suitable policies and national legislations, also specifically on space debris mitigation. And what do you think that are the challenges ahead, and how will the situation develop in the future? So Ms. Tanja, she's an assistant professor and deputy director of the International Institute of Aerospace Law at Leiden University. And I would also like to mention that she's also a Space Women pioneer, as she was the first female member of honor of the Netherlands Space Society. So welcome, thank you so much for being present here today, to be an example of to all the women present. And please give us an overview of what you think, following also the presentation of Ana Cristina.
Okay, thank you very much, Ursula. And hello, everyone, and congratulations on having these webinars in the framework of UN for Women, which is a wonderful initiative and a very important one to promote STEM, but even beyond science, technology, math and engineering. I would say also the arts and the social sciences, and of course also law. So it's very nice that you are spending this webinar on space law and policy, and I'm happy to contribute and to answer questions. Of course, you're right that we should encourage more states to ratify the treaties, but remember that the Outer Space Treaty, which is like the constitution of outer space, has 110 states parties and some 23 or so states that have signed the treaty, so they're also more or less bound to not violate the object and purpose of this treaty. So it's really a vast majority of members of the United Nations, 193 I think there are, that are somehow connected to these space treaties. And of course, the UN COPWAS, the committee that Ana Cristina mentioned, also the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, always makes efforts to encourage more states to ratify these treaties. So there are many efforts to do that. But of course, the issue is that when these treaties were negotiated in the 1950s, 60s, the problem of the congestion of outer space was not foremost on the mind of the drafters. What was at the time, the major concern is to keep outer space for peaceful purposes. The states, mainly the United States and the Soviet Union, wanted to make sure that there would not be a weapons race and that all outer space uses would be complying with that principle of peaceful uses of outer space. Of course, with the years going by, there are more and more states, more and more actors, including private actors, who are now using space for the benefit of advancing humanity. And we cannot imagine any day without the use of space technology nowadays. If we would turn off the satellites, we would all be lost. We would not have GPS and no television and no weather forecast, and we could not use the ATM machines. So we're completely dependent, and that dependence also means that we have to make sure that we maintain outer space for future generations, that we keep it sustainable. So that is really a topic that you see high on the agenda of many committees, including the UN COPWAS, but that you also see among actually the operators, the private companies. Beyond those treaties, which of course have to be ratified, which do not unfortunately contain very clear rules on regarding space debris, as I mentioned, they do have some pointers. They say that you have to have due regard for the interests of other states. You should not harmfully contaminate. You can be held liable if your space object causes damage on Earth or in outer space. So there are basic rules. But these rules have to be supplemented and have to be increased with other principles. And that's why we have those debris mitigation principles that were mentioned earlier, both the principles of the UN COPOS, but there are also the IADC, the Interagency Debris Coordination Committee, which is a cooperation among space agencies. But you also see now even initiatives among the space industry. The Space Data Association, or more recently the Space Security Consortium, I think it's called, which was established just last year, which means that the industry itself and the users also realize that it is important to have certain rules of the road. And I'm sure Kai-Uwe will mention the space traffic management subject and studies that are being carried out in that context. The legal issues of space debris, I think, can split them in remediation and mitigation. Mitigation is to make sure that we do not create more debris, and we have those guidelines that have been mentioned. The next step will be remediation, to clean up outer space, and there I think there are even more legal issues that would have to be arranged, of course, in addition to all the technical ones. But you do see industry that is starting to become interested in this as a business case. And they are developing all kinds of technologies, whether it's harpoons or nets or what have you, combined with on-orbit servicing, so being able to refuel a satellite or repair it, instead of immediately discarding it because there is a little problem. You cannot very easily go to a garage and have your satellite repaired. So all these possibilities that are becoming reality in terms of technology also really create important legal questions. You can make parallels with the shipping industry, for instance, where you can have a salvage industry, where somebody can go and create a business case out of salvaging your ship and selling the scrap metal or whatever. The problem with space law is that we have some kind of eternal ownership, and so unless you have very clear legal contracts in place, you will not be advised to go and just grab a satellite. It was also mentioned earlier, I think, that space technology is often used for national security purposes. So if you can take out a broken satellite, you could just as well go and steal the technology and use it for your benefit. So the military or national security aspects are important as well. Is a space object, is a space debris still a space object? What would commit fault? What would constitute fault if you have a case of damage in outer space? But we do see things happening. There are companies like Astroscale who want to clean up space. You also have ESA, which Kai-Uwe can probably talk about also, which has the clear space mission to clean up a piece of rocket, of a Vega rocket. And Northrop Grumman actually did a docking with an Intelsat satellite to perform on-orbit surfacing. So we see things happening. We see an increasing awareness. We have basic principles. The Outer Space Treaty is a treaty on principles, but we will need to address more detailed legal issues to ensure that these activities can take place in a safe legal environment. And I think everybody agrees that it has to be done. It's getting congested more and more with companies like Elon Musk's SpaceX, which wants to launch thousands of satellites. We need to have rules of the road to deorbit those satellites. They have to have maneuverability. They need to get insurance. So there are a lot of measures that you can think of. But basically, who is obliged to clean up, who will pay for it, who is liable if something goes wrong, all those questions will need answers. I'm sorry, I'm raising more questions than answering them, but maybe this gives a little overview of some of the topics, and I'll be happy to answer specific questions, but maybe leave it for this for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanja, for putting all things together and for giving a more specific overview of this issue, and also seeing that there are actually not only public initiatives but also private initiatives that are contributing to address this issue. It's very interesting. Also, following that space needs to be for all. This is something that needs to be addressed globally, altogether, because it doesn't concern only space or operating satellites or current space missions, but as it was mentioned previously as Cristina, there are also some emergencies that happen here on Earth, and these are very important things that needs to be addressed and taken into consideration. And also, just to mention, I would also like maybe to focus a little bit on now that we have more guidelines that have been established by the UN. There is lots of contradictory points between the international community that I have seen recently, since if we adopt more regulations, for example, requiring that satellites have the technology to deorbit themselves independently, sometimes it's contradictory to the fact that if we want to give access to space to all countries, this is something that is going to increase in huge amounts the space budget, especially for developing countries. So how we can address this issue, how we could find something that is more equilibrated between developing countries and developed countries, space faring nations, and also what do you think about the issue? I think you have lots of points to discuss, and I would also like to know more about the perspective that Kai has on this. And since Professor Kai has been chair from the United Nations Committee for the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space in 2014 and 16, I think maybe he can give us an overview of what are the current space law developments, what has been discussed within the committee. And I would also like to thank you to be present here today, Professor Kai-Uwe Schrogl. He is the president of the International Institute of Space Law, a global association of space lawyers for almost 15 countries. And welcome to the show, and please give us your overview following the discussion with Cristina and Tanja. What do you think about the subject? How do you see the future? And what do you think also that could be the possible solutions to some contradictory items on space risk mitigation, specific on space traffic management?
Thank you very much, Ursula, for the kind introduction. And I must say, I'm very glad to be here with you. And I'm also very glad that you selected the topic of space debris, because space debris is one of the key issues in outer space activities. It's a regulatory problem, it's a legal, a policy problem, and it's also a technological problem. And when I say problem, I should also be a little bit more cautious to name everything a problem, because as Tanja also indicated, there are a lot of positive elements, and we must see that the international community has made great progress in realizing the issue, analyzing it, providing for ideas, technological ideas, ideas how to cope with it on a political and legal level, and even adapting at least a number of standards. So I was very pleased to hear the excellent presentations of Cristina and of Tanja, and I can pick a few of the elements which they raised and which you, Ursula, also asked me to present in this short introductory statement. In general, I should say that when you deal with the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN did not expressly mention the outer space environment as part of the environment of Earth, but it simply is. And we have to take care, and we have to apply the same principles and the same responsibility we have as a world community to outer space as we have it to Earth, its inhabitants, its livestock, and its nature. Now, turning back to the issue of space debris. It has been mentioned that we have the space debris mitigation guidelines, but we do not have anything which is really internationally binding. The guidelines are guidelines. They are open for use, and nobody can be forced to implement them, and nobody will be penalized or punished if not doing so. We still hope a little bit, I must say, in the international community that there is this kind of enlightened self-interest, that the states and the actors in outer space say, well, I have to use it, I have to make it safe, so I take care of it. But look around on Earth, we are destroying the environment, and we don't take care. So why should the actors in outer space take care by their own, out of self-interest, and not being, let's say, forced to do so through regulation? So the first thing is we have to make what we already have binding. And this has to be done in UN Corpus, in the legal subcommittee. And imagine, for more than 20 years now, the states resist to have legal issues of space debris in the legal subcommittee. So far they say it's a technical issue. We do that in the scientific technical subcommittee or the main committee. No, it has to be done in the legal subcommittee, and there we have to deal with the definition of space debris, with then the mitigation and remediation issues, as well as with the related topics of, in particular, liability. Now, where are the real problems nowadays? It is indeed the congestion of outer space. It has been mentioned that we will have the mega constellations of satellites. And when you see one company is launching 2,000 satellites, then you ask yourself, and I have seen it already in the questions, why should such a company with 2,000 satellites apply the same standards as the one university with one little CubeSat? So we also have to find a way of calibrating the space debris mitigation guidelines for specific activities where, for example, when you have 1,000 satellites on one plane, the rule of deorbiting only in 20 years is completely nonsense and has to be reduced to 10, 5, or even less years. So this is one of the keys which we have to develop. The second is we do not have really incentives for applying debris mechanisms. As long as we have competition in outer space, not doing sound and good mitigation for debris is a competitive advantage. So we have to find also incentives for the actors in outer space to actually apply the debris mitigation. And there we haven't been creative yet. We really have to find new ideas, like real incentives, finding, for example, when it comes to taxing space activities, tax reduction for those who are very good in view of debris mitigation, and to really think ahead in completely new terms. Last point. It already had been mentioned by you and by Cristina as well as Tanja. We have to find a way how to frame space debris mitigation and remediation. It cannot be seen anymore as a single issue. It is part, on the one hand, and for the national legislation, national activities. So it has to be part of every single national space law, but again, this has to be harmonized to have a level playing field. And the second point is to frame it a little broader into something which we have been developing as space traffic management, as one single building block for a traffic management regime. And this would also make space debris being not related to nothing, but being a part of a more broader and comprehensive framework, which makes it also then easier to come up with new ideas, to link it with issues, and then to find a better way of making the mitigation guidelines or then the regulation applicable. So there are a number of problems. The good thing is we have identified them, and member states and also private companies are serious in tackling them. And well, we have to see how big the incentives for the member states in UN COPUOS are to really act and to find and come up with solutions which are actually binding. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kai, for your very interesting presentation and also for answering the questions. It has been really enlightening for me that you have been able to answer the questions. So just to put things all together, yeah, it's very important to calibrate the infrastructure of all private companies and also spacefaring nations that have infrastructure in space. Calibrate and also with the countries that are currently currently having access to space. This is also very important, and also to put some requirements, as you mentioned previously. The orbiting a satellite 20 years is too much. Maybe we can reduce to 10, 5. We can do this path little by little. And this was also very interesting what you mentioned that UNCDG didn't consider the space something of the space agenda, the agenda of 2030. This is something that also can be considered for the future. And thank you also for giving your perspective of the incentives. I think this is something that could really help the international community in general, and to direct things towards something that is more specific, since it's a concern for everybody. And also considering that not all countries count with existing space detection programs. And the more countries are going to have access to space, the more it's going to be difficult to manage things in outer space, and also the more it will be difficult to avoid collisions happening there that are going to be not only dangerous for space missions, but also here on planet Earth. So it was very interesting what you mentioned on the taxes and also the incentives. I would like to give now the word to Tanja to follow up the discussion, and maybe since she also is part of the International Institute of Air and Space law, what do you think? Are there any connections on the aviation law that could be implemented in space? What do you think about the subject of the recent elements that have been mentioned previously?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very interesting question, and I saw it also coming up in the chat. You know, I work in an institute for air and space law, and sometimes we wonder, you know, should we not disconnect the two because they are so completely different. Aviation is based on sovereignty, and space law is based on the absence of sovereignty. So they are really almost opposite of each other. On the other hand, of course, each of these regimes learns from each other, and there are certain parallels. Space law is not a silo. It should be seen as a part of international law. And so any lessons that we learn from aviation law, or from the law of the sea, or from Antarctica is useful in a limited extent. It's, of course, an analogy is never perfect. But if you look at that point that Kai-Uwe raised about the necessity to have certain incentives for actors to indeed comply with the regulations. And I have to say that the numbers are for geostationary orbits quite encouraging, because there I think it's about 80% that complies actually with the mitigation guidelines. In geostationary orbit, you have to put your satellite into a higher orbit, into what is called a graveyard orbit, after that 25-year rule. In LEO, however, the compliance is less than 60%, I think, and it's even only 20% in orbits that are above 650 kilometers. So there, you do need those incentives, and possibly legally binding ones. And whether that's international or national, I'm not very hopeful for new international binding law, because the whole situation in the whole community of states is not very positive in the sense of accepting new binding rules. And you see that in other areas as well, in air law, in climate change, in wherever. But even if you have good national rules that form a certain pattern, I agree that some harmonization is necessary, but you could have those guidelines at UN level that serve to create that sort of harmony. Then all those new private actors would be bound by them. Of course, in the end, it will be a responsibility of states. They have that obligation under the Outer Space Treaty to authorize and supervise activities by private entities. So national governments do have an obligation to make sure that their private entities do not violate international agreements, and hence even the non-binding guidelines on debris can become binding under national law. And I think Cristina mentioned a few in her slides. There are a growing number of countries that make compliance with debris mitigation guidelines a license requirement. So it then becomes binding under international law. With regard to the analogy with aviation law in terms of incentives, I think there is an interesting analogy in, for instance, the emission trading systems. In aviation law, airlines have to limit their CO2 emissions, and they have set up a kind of trading system, and that seems to work quite well. You could also look at environmental law, another interesting analogy, where you see the emergence of an international obligation to not pollute, and to have a rule that says the polluter pays, and to also impose the need to have environmental impact assessments before you get a license to do something. So you have to look at the responsibility of national governments to increase those testing methods, and you can look at taxes or subsidies or whatever, but in the end it will be a responsibility of national governments as far as private activities are concerned, and those are the ones that are the most risky, the most ambitious. I mean, the numbers of the planned satellites are going to double, triple, quadruple the number of active satellites that we have at the moment. So that is where we have to look, and I think the UN can play a very important role in encouraging states to enforce those guidelines, even if we do not manage to have treaty law, but to at least encourage states to implement the guidelines at the national level in national law, and to indeed look at other areas where you have environmental law, aviation law, where we can find lots of examples of those incentives. And just to end, maybe to point you to a very recent study published by the OECD on the cost of space debris. It's a very interesting report. If you Google OECD space debris, I'm sure you can find it. Maybe somebody can find the link for the chat. And there the final message was, yes, taking care of not creating space debris or cleaning up space debris, so mitigation and remediation, is costly. It will require an effort from operators, but not doing anything will in the end be more costly, because then it will mean that we are going to a situation where we can simply not use low Earth orbit anymore, because you have the Kessler syndrome and collisions, and it's simply not sustainable for all the wonderful uses that we can make of outer space. So I think a realization, so also their capacity building and awareness creation that we have, that we're in this together, I think that will greatly help. I hope that answers your question. Thank you, Alisa, for putting the link to that document.
Thank you, Tanja. Thank you for saying that. Yes, we are in this, in all of this together, and in fact, the UN plays a very crucial role in this, in trying to find harmonization for the public and also for the private, specifically for the private sector. And yes, it was very interesting that since space debris regulations is still considered a soft law, in order to create more binding regulations, it is very important that countries realize the importance of this, the cost of this, and what could be the dangers that we could have also in the future, because this is going to be not only costly for private companies or in general for all space actors, but specifically also to spacefaring nations, that they could really suffer from accidents happening there due to the collision of space objects. So very interesting what you said about environmental assessment, and also the importance of encouraging states developing national legislations that could make the UN COPOS space debris guidelines binding, at least in some way. Thank you, and I would like to give now the word to Cristina. Maybe she can give us her perspective of what we have mentioned right now, or maybe a perspective of some examples of license and national legislations that maybe have already addressed this issue. Just to wrap up things up, I think we are running a little bit out of time. It's a very broad subject, but thank you to all panelists that there are lots of points all together, very interesting, and lots of points also to reflect upon. Thank you, and please, Anna, I'll give you the word. I don't know, maybe, yes.
During the discussion, I was also thinking the possibility, as we now approved the United Nations Space Debris Guidelines, I think in the future, these guidelines could be adopted as a principle. Could be a hard to transform this as principles under international space law.
Yes,
Professor Tanja or Professor Kai-Uwe, or this could be a challenge. Adopt the guidelines as a principle, will be approved as a principle in the future.
Can we unmute Kai or Tanja, please?
Yes, thank you. I take it first. Of course, we have to do something, and I would like to point out that we have to learn. We have to be a little bit more flexible, a little bit more creative. I indicated it, but it can be extended. Tanja mentioned a few areas where we can learn from, and these are, on the one hand, look at the other global commons. High sea, Antarctica, cyber also. We have to learn from the mechanisms there and how it's done there. We have to think of moratoria, for example, thresholds, fees, codes of conduct. We are too locked into space as a singularity. So we have to open up. And this is particularly true that we can learn from environmental policy and environmental law. So a greater openness of our community. And this also boils down to what I indicated, which is the calibration. In particular, in the field of space debris mitigation, there is no good for everything and good for all. We have to look into how to treat the GSO as we already do, which is a completely different regime. We have to look at mega constellations, we have to look at CubeSats, university CubeSats, and we have to make and think more of tailor-made rules. And this all turns to the issue of how to handle that. And there, space traffic management as a bigger concept to catch all, from how to get into outer space, how to operate in outer space, and how to return to Earth from outer space. This is the approach which has to be taken. So a single call and a simple call, and this is, I think, good for you, your organization, which is looking broader from the perspective of the Sustainable Development Goals as a whole, and then entering it, what we can learn from that to the field of space. And this kind of spirit is, I think, needed, and thanks to you, we get incentives to think about that. Thank you very much that I could participate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maybe we can give a mute Tanja so she can follow up.
Yeah, I fully agree. And as for the question, can we make compliance with debris mitigations a new principle? I'm not quite sure if I understood it correctly. I mean, as I said earlier, personally, I'm not too positive, let's say, optimistic about making new international binding law. I would also be very hesitant about making any kind of changes to the international treaties that we have. Sometimes you hear the proposal to let's add another article to the Outer Space Treaty. That is usually quickly taken off the table, because as soon as you would start to do that, you might lose the fragile balance of agreement that has been reached nearly 60 or so years ago to agree on certain rules of the road. And even the countries where the most ambitious plans are with private enterprise and so on in the United States, there was a debate. Even there, the agreement was that we should not touch the Outer Space Treaty. It contains the basics, and we can build on it further. Certainly, we need to implement the rules and make it more comprehensive and address all the issues that were simply not foreseeable. But in the end, I believe that the let's say the interdependence of states and the critical dependence that we all have on outer space will prevail. And if you look at all areas, also in the areas of using frequencies and orbits, so the area that the International Telecommunication Union is dealing with, there are, of course, problems of harmful interference and spamming and jamming and cyber that Kai-Uwe mentioned also. But it is really a very small part. For the most part, the international cooperation and the due regard for each other's activities works. The challenge will be to also make it work with all those new actors who have, of course, a business perspective, who want to make a profit. So we have to make sure that that transition is made smoothly. And also, of course, the current increased tension in the world with the creation of space forces and the anti-satellite tests, which greatly contribute to increasing the amount of debris. The Indian one last year, the Chinese one, and others. Those are things that have to be solved, and that have to be solved by international diplomacy in the United Nations. But all in all, I am on the positive side and quite hopeful that as humanity, we can address these problems together.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tanja. Yes, I think we can. We have the capability, we have the knowledge. Thank you so much for giving these insights. It's very important to further on the enrichment of the UN treaties for outer space. And also, as Professor Kai mentioned previously, something that could very help a lot to address this issue is to build up tailored measures to space actors. Thank you, Ana Cristina, also for giving an overview of what are the current regulations that are present and how UN COPUS is also addressing the issue. So it has been very interesting. I have seen lots of questions in the chat. I will really hope that maybe in another time we could also join up together and talk about in specific more about the questions that have been raised in the chat. And thank you so much for all the knowledge, all your expertise, and also for transmitting your perspective on this issue. So thank you so much for being present here today. And I'll give the word to Hien for the closing part and for take also the picture of the show. Thank you. Hien, you are in mute.
You hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you for everyone. Thank you to my mentors and friends out there. Professor Tanja, I met at the International Space University, and it was a pleasure to meet you. Professor Dr. Kai-Uwe. Thank you, Anna, my friends, and Alicia, everyone who's helping making this happening. I'm really honored to share with you that this show is the 4th show. We had some really great feedback hearing that mentees are really getting out there, connecting, collaborating, getting jobs and sharing their stories. It's very touching to see what's happening out there. So thank you, everyone. We also have now like a Space4Women fan page. So if you choose, there you can follow up with participants and engage and ask further questions. We also will all shows will have a summary and a recording. So the questions that are here unanswered, I know there are a lot of questions, unanswered questions in the chat. Alisa will help. We are all going to follow up to answer these questions in the report for you. So thank you so much for your time. Last shot is a group shot, a picture. Everyone on video, so if you choose.